Right, so I'm just sort of starting to block out the different functionality or aspects of the Caret controller. The last thing that we still needed to do was a jump. So two things need to happen in a jump. We need to check whether we're allowed to jump. So we need a ground test. That's pretty much happening all the time. And then we need to spur on the actual action. So on the button press, we need to, based on whether or not we're grounded, we need to be able to exert some sort of force. Now, if we're using root motion, then we also need to switch off root motion before we can add a force to our character. So that needs to happen. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly run through what's happening over here and then try and make sense of it for you. Now, this is something else that's sort of some randomization thing that I'll cover with you just now. Let's call this random. Okay, and I'm just going to plug that out in case it creates anything weird. Right, so this section over here, this is our ground check. So I'm going to just maybe pull these a little bit closer together. Okay, and group those. Okay. Okay, so in the ground check, what we're doing is we're actually, we're finding our player position, right? So that's getting the position of itself. Then we're raycasting from that position in the negative y axes. And we're only doing it for a very short distance. We only really need to know whether we're on the ground or not. Okay, so that's like half the distance. And then if we're grounded, so if it actually hits something, this is a Boolean, we can say, okay, then we can check whether or not we can jump. So we're doing this all the time, and we're also exposing the raycast here to see what the distance is between what it hits and if it's actually hitting the ground or not, okay, if it's close enough. So if it's anything less than 0.05, it means we're right on the ground, which means we can then reset the animator bool, or we can tell the animator that it's now grounded, and we can also tell the animator to reapply root motion. If it's not less than that amount, then it's probably still in the air, which is why we tell the animator that it's not grounded, and we keep our, we actually reset our jumping value to false. Okay? Which will lead on to a kind of a falling check, which we're not doing at the moment, but we will. We'll be able to set the fall based on the velocity of the character. So if it's falling for long enough, then the velocity should eventually build up, and we could test for a specific range. So this is all it's doing at the moment. The main components being the raycast, and then just checking the raycast information. You can expose the raycast. Okay, and this all really doesn't mean anything until we start pressing the jump button. So on button input, Mine is set to up because, well, I'll show you what happens. So let's just let's ignore all of that for now. We don't have to do any of this, and let's just see what happens if I just say on button event down, test whether I'm grounded. Okay, so this basically, once I press jump, check whether this raycast is actually hitting something. So if the raycast is hitting something, if it's true, it means it's grounded, and then it can go on to do whatever it needs to do when it needs to jump. Okay, which is this. Even simpler actually, I'm gonna just let me just ignore that for now. There's another add force, so I can say add force. Rigid body force and what mode it is, but you can also do XYZ and mode. So if you're driving your character using non-root motion, so just axis input or forces already, then this force could just be combined with that, and you don't have to necessarily add additional forces to it. So for now, if we just say, when I press the button, add force, and it doesn't actually need to do any of that. So I'm just going to say add force 50, and I want the force to be an impulse. So just at one point, add 50 on the y-axis when I hit the jump button, and you're only allowed to do this when grounded is true. Okay, then it sets the animator bool to jumping, which then tells the animator it needs to jump. It switches off the root motion so that when the jump animation plays, that this force is actually driving it upwards. Okay. I suppose if I cut it off here, let's see what happens if I just do jumping true. Okay, so I'm gonna just exit here, go back. Okay, so if we hit play, and I just say jumping is true. Okay, cool. So there's a bunch of other things that's trying to happen here. Jumping just stays true, so it eventually stops. Okay, so it does want some sort of force. Let's do switch off the animator. And then we add a force on 50. So you can see now that force is being exerted and the character moves in the y direction. Okay, and then this one over here, it sets root motion back so that your character can continue moving around. Okay, so once the distance is less than 0.05, it sets the Boolean to grounded. Now there is a bit of a problem here, something that I'm trying to rectify. This seems to work just fine, and that kind of works, but the jumping backwards doesn't seem to add enough distance in the y. It seems like he's kind of like staying in one place and doesn't look very natural. So what I was attempting to do there to fix that is also pick up which direction it was moving beforehand. So I'm actually getting the velocity from the character, and I'm multiplying the velocity that I'm getting back into the force. Okay, so if I do that instead of just setting it to static values, then I can go, so from that vector, what's happening here is that it's getting the velocity. You'll see as I run around, let's quickly try to go there. Okay, So as I'm running around, press the jump, you can see that it's getting the velocity from the character. Okay, so it's got the velocity from the character. It's then taking that velocity and it's multiplying it by a certain number. Now I've gone and set up a little extra bit over here with a timer. Wait, I'm gonna come back to this timer element before I multiply this velocity in there. Let's go back to the standard version. I'm just applying some force in the Y. Sorry, that doesn't need to be connected. So if I'm only applying force in the Y, the problem with this is that since it's checking for the ground, every time I press the button, it's going to check and see whether I'm close enough to the ground. But there is a point where your jump is close enough so you get to jump again, right? So you can, if you spam the button, you get to jump really high. And trust me, players are going to do this. They're going to spam your buttons and check when they break. So it's a bit of a problem because you get like false positives on this. Let's see what it does if we're down here. Press the same buttons. So every now and then we slip through and create a false grounded sense, because that variable, I've also asked the variable to have a, I actually put it at the back of this string here, so if we just hook that up again, that is, it's actually just getting the float from the distance, the raycast that I've exposed, and it's just debugging that. So if I look at my console, you'll get the value from the height. Okay, and you can see that every now and then I get to sneak in another jump in between. Okay, so there's a real quick fix for that. If I go back here, there's actually a component called cooldown. Now, if you look at the Bolt documentation, it's got this really nice breakdown of all the time elements in Bolt. So there's weights. Now, I could have said, okay, well, just wait a few seconds before you can do that. And that's kind of what it's doing anyway, except the cooldown module gives you, there's even this wait for flow. So you can have, like for combos and things like that, you can say, do this one first and then wait for that one and then wait for that one. If you've pressed all of these buttons, then only execute. Okay, so that's a kind of a cool way of dealing with combos. And then there's the cooldown one, which has an input. And then the moment that it receives that input, it says it's ready, but it waits for that duration before it can fire off the next instance. So it's not ready until that time has passed. Okay, you also get a timer, which gives you more parameters and a time elapsed. I'll get back to that just now. Okay, so right, so if we want, we can simply run this jump through a cooldown period, which means it'll fire off the first time, but it won't let me spam the button. So if I press jump now, you'll see that I can jump at first, but I can't just spam it. It waits and then it only fires the branch. Now I can set the duration to be much higher, and I can also tell it to be unscaled, meaning that it doesn't rely on frame rate, it's always consistent. but this is actually fine. And it does a pretty good job of just keeping out those additional jump presses. Okay, so then we're running this through the cooldown. We're saying that when it's ready, then do the check, see if it's grounded. If it's true, then you can set the animator bool to jumping, you can set root motion to off, and then you can apply a force. And like I was saying earlier, what we can do is we can apply this force based on the rigid body values that we get. So we can use the rigid body and the current trajectory as its its momentum, and then apply that momentum to our force over here. So instead of going and saying, okay, just apply a vertical force, I can say, okay, cool, let's get these values from the rigid body, let's get the momentum, and then let's multiply them in there along with our vertical force. Okay, so I'm going to do that instead, and this is set to velocity change, and I tend to change this based on various outcomes. So see whatever works best. Force is supposed to be a constant force until it exits that that node. Acceleration gradually increases. Impulse is just a once-off force, and velocity change simply changes the velocity. But with velocity change, you can get like the sort of a jumpy effect. It's just for some reason I'm not getting, even though the values are coming through, the force isn't actually being applied properly. So I'm going to see if I can rectify that, give you an update on it, but you'll see what I mean if I press play. So if I jump now, or if I run and jump, okay, well, it seems to be, you can see it does go backwards a little bit, but it seems to stop. So I am changing the velocity. Okay, let me explain what's happening over here a little bit more. Okay. So then what I did was I said this jump only actually needs to happen on the up of the button. Okay, then it can check. Because what I want the down to do is actually look at the elapsed time, at the time that I spend holding this button down. Okay, because that needs to, let me just get into the right window, that needs to actually build up to a point, and then as I let go, it's supposed to be a multiplier. Okay, so it gets a value based on, or it starts this timer whenever I press the button, and then it carries on running that timer and sets the variable. Then once I let go, it's going to run into this branch over here, take the variable based on the time that I spent holding it down, and multiply that into my existing velocity. Basically what I'm saying is, the longer I hold the button, the higher the character is supposed to jump. And that doesn't seem to be, or it seems to be happening, but the time it takes, so if we take an even closer look here at the branches and what's happening, so the time that it takes to check whether it's grounded is too quick. So it's almost as if the force never gets time to fully have an impact on the character before the root motion takes back the control of the character. So what I would need to do is somehow control or do another check in here. So instead of just applying the root motion again, once it's grounded, to actually check whether the animation's finished playing. So I would need to set events in my character controller on the animations itself, and then do another check. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here and set up that system, and then I can I'll pick it up from there again. Whoops. Okay. So the whole thing was that the set or apply root motion was switched on too quickly, so the velocity check didn't get, or the velocity that we're adding to our character didn't have enough time to settle in and actually have an effect on the character. So you need to have this finished jump event on some of your jump events to set the root motion back again. So I've done it on the backflip. So if I go into my animator over here, I can see all my jump events are from the any state over here, so they happen whenever jumping is true. The parameters are set, so there it says jumping's true, grounded is true, sprint is true, and Z is -1, is less than -1. So it means that he's running backwards, then he can do a backflip. This one says Z just needs to be less than 0.1, -0.1. So this is he's walking backwards, then he jumps backwards. This is him hopping, and that's him jumping forward, and that's him forward flipping. So again, we're just looking at the Z-axis and seeing what the, how fast he's going. And in this case, sprinting is false there. Sprinting, that doesn't really matter. But most of the time, all we need to go and do now is check when he's actually grounded, so that we don't switch it back immediately and the switch doesn't happen so fast. We actually give it some time to play through the event. Now, I can already foresee that this would incur some other issues, like if you were jumping off a cliff, but your jump animation's actually finished playing, it'll set root motion back to be active, and then you're going to be stuck in the air. So you'll probably want to do do the animation event, but then check whether you're actually grounded or not. So this sort of needs to form part of this bigger ground check, and only then do we actually, or another branch in here that checks whether this is actually true, and then we can set it back to be the actual root motion. Okay, but first of all, how we set the events is you'll have to go into the animation, then check on the animation where exactly you want the character to be grounded again, like around about here is a good space for the character to be grounded again, and root motion to start taking effect. It's actually not when it's grounded, but when you want to start it when the character starts moving again, because if you exclude that movement, then you'll find that your character slips a bit. So at that point when the character starts moving again, or puts its foot on the ground, around about there, go into events, create the event, and that's the trick here. For this animation event to be triggered, you need to specify trigger animation event, and then because we use the string called fin jump, you just need to say fin jump. Okay, if you have other objects with fin jump events happening in there, you would have to specify the object as well. Otherwise, I found that you don't actually need to do that. So now this jump should also, we just need to apply that. Now this backwards jump should also work, and I'm just going to do that for all my jumps real quick. So on forward hop, we'll go and boop right there. That's where we want the event. Again, trigger event, fin jump, apply. Okay, and one more time, forward jump, go to the jump event, and he lands. So at that point, we want root motion to be active again. fin jump and apply. And then one last forward flip. And he jumps, boom, and lands. I don't know why he lands outside of his... He's just landing a little higher than what he's supposed to, but okay. I'm not sure why that's happening. Okay, but that seems to be the landing. And I'm just going to create an event there called trigger animation event. And the string is fin jump. So now each of these fire off the event set over here, and then that restores my root motion. And nothing else does it at the moment. So it'll work fine for most ground plane activities. The moment that you go up to a higher level and you jump off there, you're going to need to ground check before you set root motion back. So only if this is actually true. Okay, but we can't just fire that off. So we'll need to branch out again and see whether it's actually grounded. Okay, but for now, let's see whether this runs. Cool. So that that didn't work. And I'm stuck. I jump backwards and it switches it on again. Okay, so there's a jump somewhere that I missed. I think it's the sideways jump. I just have to go and check. So if I'm sprinting sideways and jumping, it just goes into locomotion. Okay, so there's a bunch of things I still need to fix there. But the velocity seems to be quite a nice addition. But the sideways still affect it a lot more than the backwards and forwards. Okay, but hopefully that helps you set up a jump and then continue exploring with like methods to keep your character grounded and checking and back to the animator. Okay, so I'm going to come and help you with your setup.